Hello and welcome to the first ever Age of Extinction videocast. My name is Patrick Greenfield. I'm a reporter on the Age of Extinction project. We write about biodiversity loss and how we can stop it. This videocast is for our Wild Cities Week, which is about urban biodiversity, which is very topical at the moment with all the wildlife we're seeing in our cities because of the coronavirus lockdown. The title of this videocast is the question we're asking today is how can we make space for nature in urban areas? To help answer that, I am joined by Dr Rana El-Sabaawi, an associate professor of biology at the University of Victoria in Canada. She is an ecologist with a particular interest on animal diets and nutrition and how urbanization affects that. Welcome, Rana.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And our other guest is Professor Menno Schilthuizen. He is an evolutionary biologist at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He is the author of Darwin Comes to Town, about how animals and plants are rapidly evolving and adapting to life in the cities, well, some of them at least. If you would like a flavour of Darwin Comes to Town, do check out Menno's TED Talk. We will put links to both in the bio. So, hello, Professor Schilthuizen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So just to explain a little bit about how the format's going to work, in a second, both of our guests are going to start talking about the title. But yes, this is a video cast, but unfortunately we are not live at the moment. We hope to do more of these in the future where you can send in and react comments. But for now, we've collected those questions beforehand. But do let us know what you thought of this conversation at the end and whether you think we should do more. So to return to the title, I mean, Rana, I'll start by asking you, what are your thoughts on how we can make space for nature in urban areas?
Well, this is something I think about quite a lot, especially I've been thinking about it during the quarantine quite a lot during the lockdown. And I think you can think about this question in multiple ways. The first one, and I think that this is something that's happening across the globe right now, is we can make space for nature in our cities by simply observing nature in our cities. All across cities that are on lockdown, there are programs for little kids to observe nature in their backyards or from their balconies or from their windows. And that's a really good step towards recognizing that there is nature in the city and that it's wonderfully diverse and very interesting. And then there are some systematic things that we can do. So increasing our knowledge of urban biodiversity, understanding what causes the biodiversity patterns we see in cities, and then how to protect green spaces in cities, the pockets of nature that we do have. So whether it's parks or protected areas or even restored areas. And finally, the biggest thing that we can do going forward is making sure that when we're planning the expansion of our cities, that we actually do it in a way that welcomes nature and that allows us to coexist with nature or to create spaces of pockets of nature in any new development.
Menno?
Well, yeah, I fully agree with that. And in addition, I would say when we talk about creating space for biodiversity in cities, we often automatically think about the areas that are under municipal control, like parks and green spaces. But we often tend to forget that in many cities, a large part of the green spaces are private. They're private gardens, balconies, small areas that the authorities don't have any control over, and private individuals do have control over. And I think that's a very important part of natural areas in the city that could benefit from all kinds of ways, if only, only already by the fact that everybody arranges their garden, if they have one, or their balcony in a different way. And you create variety, ecological variety, simply by these different tastes that people have in the way they arrange their gardens.
Okay, I guess I wanted to take a step back to begin with as well. This is not a wholly positive story. Humans have chosen to live in the towns and cities of today, I imagine in part because of life-sustaining ecosystems and the biodiversity that comes with that. But these are now cities full of steel and glass and concrete, and we're losing nature. how, Rana, please start with you, Rana. How have we ended up here?
Well, I think the short answer to this is thoughtlessness. You know, I think that humans don't have a very good history of considering nature in their development. And I think especially cities as we know them now, and that from their early history, were established in times where people thought they were conquering nature rather than living within it. And you're absolutely right. Like, a lot of our major cities are there and exist because they are close to areas that provide a lot of services, that have a lot of natural resources that humans rely on. But I think the value of urban biodiversity specifically, I think we only very recently started to appreciate that. And so I think the answer to your question is that this is kind of a symptom of how human development has been, and a symptom of our general attitudes towards nature that we didn't really acknowledge were flawed until fairly recently in human history.
And what do you think about that, Menno?
Yeah, it's. I think it's a very good point to make that traditionally our settlements have been a way to conquer nature, to carve out our favorite niche in an area that may not even have that niche. We've created the space where we feel at home, and whether other species would feel at home there was not our prime interest. But now that niche sort of covers the entire globe, it's time to reverse things. It's time to start realizing that part of our niche and part of our, let's say, ecological happiness comes from other species that we see around us. And it's known that our mental and physical health is improved if we're more exposed to nature. And this can be physical exposure or mental exposure. So being able to welcome more nature in our cities, or to open our eyes to the nature that is there, but that we decide not to see, will help to improve our well-being in this urbanized world.
Menno, do you think it can ever be the case that these places of concrete, steel, and glass can actually be biodiverse places that where nature is welcomed back in by humans?
I think so. I think it definitely can. I mean, there of course are urban animals that are, let's say, pre-adapted to these environments. There are many birds whose natural niche is to live in very rocky, very, very unfriendly environments, and they are the ones that we find in our cities, like rock pigeons. City pigeons are basically rock pigeons, and swifts, and birds and peregrines, birds that naturally live in very rocky, very, very unfriendly environments. They feel at home in the city. But in addition, I think one thing we should start realizing is that a lot of biodiversity is very small. It's not just, most of the biodiversity is not large mammals and large birds. It's small organisms which often are there already, except we don't notice them. They can live in very small areas. They can live in a gutter, in a little corner of green that everybody ignores. And we can try to start creating structures and buildings that have spaces for these small organisms built into them. I'm really believing in new architecture, which creates buildings that have natural niches for these small elements of biodiversity built into them, designed into them. Because in the past, of course, when your building was overgrown with vegetation and mosses, it was a sign that your building was about to collapse. But nowadays we have the technology to allow nature to colonize a building without affecting the structural integrity of it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
And Rana, when you're studying, what is science like or being an ecologist like in these urban environments? With artificial light, they're very noisy. How do you study these areas? What are the challenges?
So that's a very, very interesting question. So I have special challenges in my studies because I'm an aquatic ecologist, and so I actually sample water in urban cities. And so we have a big program of study in Brazil where we're actually looking at life in the streams in Rio de Janeiro. And so the challenge there is actually getting the samples from fairly polluted environments. And so that's, that's the biggest challenge that we deal with. We actually have to be very careful about protecting ourselves from the environments that we're sampling. But the other thing is that because of the way that we study ecology, right, we have fairly stringent requirements for replication, we have fairly stringent requirements for collecting a large number of samples. And depending on how cities are designed or not designed, sometimes we run into the challenge of actually being able to do proper statistical design for our studies within cities. And so, the goal of our program in Brazil is to compare urban and non-urban streams within a certain geographic areas. It's very hard to find streams that are consistent, that haven't had different kinds of modifications done to them. So yeah, it is a challenge to do traditional ecology in the city, but it's absolutely doable. And I think, for us, it's been difficult to rely on citizen science, but citizen science has proven to be an incredibly useful tool in a lot of urban biodiversity programs in many cities across the world.
I wanted to ask you about, I've got some questions planned about citizen science, but I mean, I wanted to ask about Darwin Comes to Town, and it seems to be that it challenges this idea that you can't watch evolution happen in real time. I mean, I think I've seen you say before that cities have become pressure cookers of evolution, and many plants and animals die and can't survive in cities, but those that survive, what's happening?
Well, those that survive are, by and large, adapting genetically to this new environment that they're living in. We're seeing many examples of animals that we share our cities with, which are rapidly evolving, really genetically changing to adapt to this new environment that we're creating. So, for example, one of the things I'm working on myself are land snails. Now we know that in cities, for example, you have this urban heat island. The center of a city can be many degrees centigrade hotter than the natural environment around the city at the same time. And we know that snails, they regulate their temperature to some extent by the color of their shells. If they have a very pale shell, they reflect the solar heat better, so they have less chance of overheating. So we're seeing in cities that evolution is actually turning these snails into paler versions of the same species outside of the city. So you have a city color which helps them, or which is actually the result of natural selection in the city center that has removed all the snails that would heat up too easily. And we see this sort of thing happening in all kinds of wild animals and plants that are living in the city and that are slowly, or sometimes actually rapidly, adapting to these very extreme conditions that we are creating.
Wow. Okay, well, I mean, it's inescapable at the moment. We can't not talk about it. So the coronavirus lockdown, and I don't know, the Bergamo boar, the goats that have been in Llandudno in Wales, the mountain lions in Santiago de Chile. I mean, the whole world is seeing wildlife appear in urban areas at the moment in ways we haven't before. Rana, what have you made of that? Is this kind of, these animals, especially that were there before, that were hiding away and are actually now appearing in the day? Or what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's very interesting. I think that we haven't really been as intensely observant of our urban environment as we have been over the last few months, being kind of stuck in the city and having to entertain ourselves. We're noticing things in our environment that we perhaps haven't noticed before. And so I think I think a lot of this is kind of people observing nature for the first time. And I think a lot of it is animals being curious, coming into cities, maybe because there's less traffic, or because, of fewer people on the roads and that sort of thing. So maybe they're feeling bolder and they're feeling more curious. But it's been really interesting watching this happen just across the world, right? It's not just one city, it's multiple cities. And it's getting a lot of attention, which is really, I don't think there's been as much urban biodiversity news I don't think we've ever focused on urban biodiversity in the news as much as we have over this lockdown. And it's generated a lot of interesting discussion. So you have the news pieces reporting all of these animal sightings, but also, I'm watching conversations on social media where people are observing birds in their backyards for the first time and noticing their behavior and noticing kind of competitive interactions and mating interactions. And I think it's a very interesting time for urban biodiversity.
Menno, do you think it's naive to think this is something that could become more normal when the coronavirus hopefully disappears? Or is this just something we've got to enjoy now and it's just of its moment?
Yeah, of course, nobody knows exactly what the world will look like after the lockdown disappears. But even if things return to what was normal a few months ago, I think you might expect to see a longer-lasting blip in the behavior of some urban animals. I mean, especially thinking of animals that really depend on us for their food. There are, of course, some extreme cases of urban animals that have completely lost their natural niche, their natural behavior, and completely dependent on us for their food. I think, rats and city pigeons, we probably don't even consider those urban nature, but those are actually the best adapted urban species that we can think of. But they're also the most vulnerable when food is not available. So I'm not sure what's happening to the rats in New York at the moment, for example. I mean, they're completely dependent on refuse from restaurants. There's to such an extent that there's actually a barrier in Manhattan between two rat populations because of the financial district, which doesn't have any restaurants. So there are no rats there. I mean, no animal rats. So I think it's quite possible that they are going to feel intense natural selection at the moment because they suddenly have to revert back to a niche that they haven't been using for decades.
Rana, did you want to say something on that? Oh, pardon me.
There's also been all these reports of rats coming into people's houses in a lot of these cities. And I totally agree with you that the natural selection aspect is going to be very interesting, especially since, even if the lockdown measures ease, restaurants are probably not going to be operating at full capacity for quite a long time. So it could actually be a long period of time when there's sustained lack of a resource that these animals are used to.
Okay, I mean, before we get to some of the photos that you've sent on kind of examples of applications that are pertinent to urban biodiversity, this is not just a subject for scientists. This is something that architects and town planners and the average person needs to be thinking about. I mean, how do we get there? What do you think mayors and local councillors and people who are in charge of what might be kind of dismissed as the boring stuff usually in local governments, what do they need to be thinking about? Menno, can we start with you?
Well, I think education is very important. Of course, there are many ways, as Rana also just said, there are many ways to open people's eyes to the biodiversity that is there. And expert biologists can show so much more than you would be able to see if you're uninitiated. So there are lots of wonderful education projects in cities focusing on urban nature and urban biodiversity that can help city dwellers realize how rich their city is and how much biodiversity there actually is. There are things like city bio blitzes. There's the the city biodiversity challenge. There are all kinds of ways to get familiar with the biodiversity that lives in your own neighborhood, in your own garden, on your own street that you weren't aware of, and that can suddenly make your environment more richer and more interesting than it was before. And of course, local governments can help to stimulate that sort of education programs.
And Rana?
So I think that this lockdown and the coronavirus has really highlighted inequities in society, and one of the equity issues that's come up is access to green space in cities. And I think that this is something that needs to be on people's radars more. If you're asking people to isolate to their neighborhoods, well, there's a lot of differences in neighborhoods in terms of green space. And given that people are restricted to being outside in green space for exercise these days in most of the cities under lockdown. This is becoming more and more important for people. And so I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is that urban biodiversity and like putting urban diversity as a goal in our city planning isn't just about nature, it's about human well-being as well, and it's about equity as well. And so I think if we recognize that it's not just one issue, it's multiple issues that are interconnected to each other, that will perhaps give us more of a motivation to do it and more of an impetus to do it.
Okay, I mean, right, I'm going to ask you about citizen science in just a second, but here comes the technical bit. Menno, you've sent some pictures in for us to look at. Right, I'm going to share my screen now. Can you both see that?
Yep.
Fantastic. Menno, what's going on here? There's a wasp. It's rather small. Why is this important?
Well, it's important because this is a new species of wasp, it's a parasitic wasp, it's a very small species, that we discovered together with a group of citizen scientists right in the center of Amsterdam last year. So one of the things we're doing is we're running these so-called taxon expeditions, which are field courses and real biodiversity discovery expeditions together with non-scientists. And we've recently, we used to go to the jungles of Borneo and to the mountains of Montenegro, but recently we've started doing these things right in the heart of a big city. So last year we did the first one in Amsterdam in the Vondelpark, which is a famous city park. And we discovered actually 2 new species of insect. And with new, I don't mean new to the Netherlands, but new to science. So they didn't have a name yet. They've been named in a scientific publication together with the people who discovered it and who live in the neighborhood. So it's their wasp. And until somebody discovers it somewhere else, it's unique to that particular city park. So that's and people often don't realize that there's so much biodiversity still left to be discovered. These parasitic wasps are an enormous group of thousands of species, many of which haven't been cataloged yet by scientists. So it's a very good way to, on the one hand, show how little we still know, how much there's still to be discovered, how you can be a real, a real naturalist in your own environment. And also at the same time to give people a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging, to have discovered a completely new species of insect in their neighborhood park really gives them a sense that this park is valuable and that it's possible, even as somebody who lives in the neighborhood, to discover new scientific knowledge about that area.
Okay, I mean, I'm not going to do all of them, but just one more. I mean, from something very, very unique to something I've definitely seen before all around the world, a seagull and a McDonald's bag. What's going on here?
Well, I guess this is one of those species, at least in the Netherlands, that has become a perfect urban adapter. It's a species that normally they're marine birds, coastal birds. But over the past few decades, they've invaded many cities, and here in Leiden, where I live, they just live in the city center and feed on human food, and they steal in the market food that's been recently purchased by people. And I think this is one of the species that is having a hard time at the moment because there's less of this sort of food available. And it's also very interesting that some of these birds have been radio tagged, so it's possible to follow how they migrate. And some of these individuals don't actually live in the city, but they are nesting in summer on islands out in the sea, and they fly for sometimes up to 100 kilometers every day to the city center to forage on this easily available French fries and other junk food. So it's very interesting to see how apparently it's worth the trouble of flying 100 kilometers to get human food rather than trying to find your own food in the sea, which may also say something about the availability of fish in the sea. Of course, it's both things could be affected by us.
Okay, right, Rana, it's your turn. So, right, screen sharing is off now. On to what we've talked about or touched on a lot. 1 second. I'm sharing that now. Okay, hopefully you can see the observations from iNature. There's a map of the world here, lots of red dots, And on the other side, there's a list of kind of species that have been identified. How does this help? First of all, what is iNaturalist, pardon me, and how does it help you with your work?
So iNaturalist is a really wonderful, I guess it's a citizen science effort. It's also a resource for people to learn how to identify nature. And so one of the ways that people become introduced to iNaturalist is that they download the mobile app and they take pictures of plants or animals that they see and they upload them to the website, and then they can get help identifying them, and they can also discuss the identifications with other scientists. And so this is a wonderful tool if you're just learning about animals in your environment. So when I started to really notice birds in my city, I downloaded iNaturalist and I learned a lot from it. But one of the nice things about it is that it connects you to a wider community. And so it gives you a sense of a global community that is really, I think, encouraging and really fun to be part of such a big effort. And one of the things that Menno talked about was this City Nature Challenge, which is, I think, run by iNaturalist or coordinated by iNaturalist. So this is a 5 to 6 day biodiversity blitz where people in cities across the world go out and they take pictures and they make identifications of species in their environments. And in previous years, it was actually a competition between cities to see who can identify them, who can make the most identifications. And this year, because of the pandemic, they've relaxed that so that it's, they don't want people taking risks being outside to take pictures of species, but they're still doing it as kind of a citizen science kind of natural observation project. And I think it starts this week. It might actually start tomorrow. So that would be April 24th, but it happens every year. And so for me, this is one of the easiest ways to become involved with biodiversity. And it's a wonderful thing if you have little kids who are in need of distraction and in need of something to occupy their time, something productive and educational to occupy their time. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, well, just to be a cynic for a second though, I'm stuck at home right now. I've only got a balcony, or not even that, a window box. How is my picture of, the insects that I can see gonna help you with your work?
So whether it helps with someone's project or not is really kind of a secondary issue. I mean, it's wonderful that we have all of these records, but when we talk about urban biodiversity, it serves multiple functions. And one of them is getting people interested in the natural environment. So even if the picture that you take doesn't end up being useful for a citizen science project, it still is a really useful and productive activity. And, this issue, to go back to this whole inequality in terms of access to nature issue that's come up during the pandemic, there's been a lot of effort to recognize that, some people have backyards and they're very lucky they have backyards and gardens and they can spend time in their backyards and gardens. But you can also do a lot of natural observation through your window. And there's actually a social media hashtag, I think it's called Nature in My Backyard. It's something started by BBC Nature, I believe. And if you click on it, I mean, the pictures that people are taking of just insects and birds out of their windows is pretty amazing. And it goes back to also something that Menno talked about, which is recognizing that biodiversity isn't just big, spectacular animals. Insects are part of natural biodiversity, probably one of the most important parts of urban biodiversity that often don't get a lot of love.
And just because these apps, it's not just there's kind of one or two. There's absolutely loads. I mean, I think something else that was mentioned in what you sent over. I always get this wrong. Audubon.
The Audubon Society. Yeah.
Right. So what is the Audubon Society?
So the Audubon Society is again, it's a nature society. It has many chapters across North America. They're primarily interested in birds and bird identification, but they do other things as well. And so they have online resources. They have wonderful guides to animals and to birds in North America. Again, it is a tool that's available out there for people to actually start learning about the different kinds of birds in their environment or the different kinds of animals that they see. And, you know, birds are a really beautiful kind of entryway to appreciating urban biodiversity because cities tend to have a lot of birds in them. And even if you don't identify the species necessarily, you can spend a lot of time learning about bird songs and what they mean. And the Audubon Society, also the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, has these wonderful resources for learning how to recognize birdsong and how to identify birdsong. And that could keep you busy in the city for a very long period of time because there's so many different birds and they all have different bird calls, and it depends on the time of year, it depends on the time of day. So it's a really fun way to learn about urban biodiversity.
Fantastic. I mean, we are running out of time a little bit, but we have been sending questions ahead of this, and I'll like to give you kind of one each on this. Menno, I guess this is it's a difficult question because it's a developing field, but this is from Hope Simpson. How can biodiversity be measured in cities in a comparable way? How can we say this is the most biodiversity versus one that maybe doesn't have that much?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends if you want to do it in a scientific way or use the citizen science approaches. I think both are possible. The scientific way, as Rana already mentioned before, requires quite stringent methods that you use. So you could, let's say, I mean, this has actually been done multiple times, but you can trap insects, for example, in a specific way for a specific duration, so that you can compare the numbers of insects that you find of different species in the city and outside of the city or in different cities. But even if you don't do it the scientific way, you could use the citizen science apps in a similar way. And of course, you trade the scientific accuracy for the volume of the data. The sheer fact that you have thousands of people watching birds or photographing plants. There are all kinds of statistical ways in which you can correct for the noise you get in those data to still say something about the differences in species numbers that you would find in a city and outside of the city. So I think both are possible and both are being done at the moment. And we've also used the citizen science websites also to measure this urban evolution that I talked about. That snail project was done by citizen scientists using an app similar to iNaturalist.
Wow. Okay, Rana, this one's for you. Lots of people are at home with their pets right now. Chessie Ritchie asks, what should I do about my cat, and can that impact on urban wildlife?
Oh, that is a very interesting and controversial question. So the question about cats when it comes to urban biodiversity is, should you let them outside? And the controversy comes from the fact that domestic cats have been known to prey on small urban mammals and urban birds. And so there's been there have been a few studies in recent years that have looked at the impacts of domestic cats on urban birds, and they can't agree on whether they have a significant impact or a small impact. And so my feeling is this, and it is a feeling, is that in areas where cats have been shown to negatively impact birds, that effect is not small. It's actually pretty big. And so my feeling is that if you're going to let your cat, if you have a cat, it's probably better for it to be indoors. It's probably better for the cat's health for it to be indoors as well. If you're going to let your cat out, then make sure that it has a bell on it so that it could actually warn other animals. But this is a fairly active area of study. It is super controversial. So those are basically my opinions.
Okay, very diplomatic. I think that is where we're gonna leave it. I want to thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. That was a fascinating conversation. I guess all that's left to say is do check out all the articles and work we're going to do for Wild Cities Week coming up, and we hope we do this again. So Dr. Rana El-Sabaawi and Professor Menno Schilthuizen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.